In this module, I'm going to provide a brief history of the seed industry. As you know, we're in our second module looking at the seed industry, so this will provide some background on the seed industry. The reading for this time is Visualizing Consolidation in the Global Seed Industry, 1996 through 2008. As with all of our readings, they can be accessed on our Compass website. This reading was published in a journal called Sustainability. And the emphasis here of this journal is a bit different than production agriculture. They don't necessarily view the consolidation as a good thing or the life sciences large companies as being sustainable. So you will see that as you're reading through that article. But again, it's a good background for the seed industry. You will also see graphs that this was produced in this article pretty much everywhere. You'll see them on the web, and they do a very nice job of linking former companies to the big six as they existed at the turn of 2010, and now we're again looking at those consolidating some more. We're going to begin with our now familiar graph of the increase in corn yields, again beginning at the late 1930s, early 1940s. We saw corn yields increase. This diagram or this figure is taken from a publication called The Seed Industry in U.S. Agriculture, and again you see the list there of the technologies that were brought on into the agricultural sector and that impact corn. I'm going to circle three of these. Adoption of hybrids. Adoption of hybrid corn reaches 95% of the corn acres. So we saw the introduction of hybrid seed corn back in the 1930s. By 1960, a relatively short period, we saw 95% of the acres using hybrid seed corn. And then another one there that you see towards the end is the adoption of biotech crops began. Note that by this time we have over 90% of the acres in the corn acres in the United States using biotech crops. I circled those three because those three are linked to the corn or the seed industry. So those adoptions have impacts on our growth of seed corn over time. Prior to the introduction of the seed industry, or prior to the 1930s, most farmers produced and saved their own seed. So at harvest, they would select the ears of corn that looked the best, and those would be then used for seed the next year. It's important to note that this self-selection had resulted in no increase in yields over time. At the early 1900s, the importance of genetics and breeding came to the front. Genetics were, identifying and selecting traits that resulted in better seeds. And then another major introduction was hybridization. And this hybridization was introduced on corn because it's relatively easy to do hybrids on corn, and it hasn't been as prevalent as in soybeans and wheat. The process of hybridization or hybrids is to develop inbred lines. So you develop lines that are have some characteristics that you may have value when crossed, but they're inbred lines, and then you cross those inbred lines to get better corn and hybrid vigor. This overhead or this slide shows the process. On the right, you see two corn plants, which would typically be in rows. Those represent inbred lines, and we want to take the pollen from the tassel on the one at the right and make sure it hits the ear on the left. In the actual process, we would detassel the one on the left, and so then we would get and be sure that that corn was crossed. The plant that would be providing the pollen, the one on the right, would not be harvested, and the ear would come from the one on the left. If you ever see this in the fields, there will be like 4 to 6 rows of detasseled corn and 1 row or so of male pollen corn, and you would destroy then the male pollen corn. The result of that would be a hybrid that a person would plant and get some hybrid vigor. In practice, there could also be double crosses, so you would do this process twice. 4 inbred lines, cross them twice to get a double cross. But in general, what you're doing is taking pollen from the male plant and transferring it to the ear of the female plant and getting a hybrid vigor. An important note here is that the seed of the hybrid, so the one on the right, once we plant it, we get the seed. If you planted that, that would not be as good as the hybrid itself. It would not perform as well. And that explains to a large extent why corn has been planted, or most of corn is purchased. Seed and wheat have lagged behind that a bit because there isn't a hybridization process used on most varieties. But for hybrids, you can't plant the seed and expect to get the same results. The public sector, land-grant universities like the University of Illinois were very much involved in the process, particularly in the 1930s all the way up into the 70s and 80s. The way the process worked and was envisioned, the land-grant universities, University of Illinois, for example, would produce the inbred lines. They would produce the inbred lines and then do some tests of the resulting hybrids and then maybe make some recommendations. Once those inbred lines were developed, foundation groups would produce them in larger quantities, and then in the original thought, successful farmers would produce the hybrids. As it turns out, it was specialized companies that produced those hybrids. As a result, we saw the launch of many companies that would produce hybrid seed corn, and you see some of those listed here, and let me just go through those. 1925 DeKalb, created in DeKalb County, Illinois, Illinois firm. 1925 Funk's Hybrids, another Illinois farm. The Agricultural Library here, Funk's Agricultural Library, was named after the family or the firm that produced those hybrids. Pfister was another company, Central Illinois. Pioneer happened to be a Iowa firm, so we do see some things come out of Iowa, I guess. But Wallace, one of its founders, turned out to be the Vice President of the United States under FDR. Northrop King is a Minnesota company. All of those companies, again, came into existence, were in the seed corn business as well as other businesses, but they typically took hybrid or inbred lines and produced single and double crosses and maybe did some breeding of their own. Here you see some of the advertisements and bags of those companies. So there were many of these companies around the Midwest and the nation, hundreds of those companies. They tended at first to serve their local area and then expand to become national and multinational companies over time. But the roots of those were regional companies serving farmers in their area. So we were going along with the seed corn companies and seed companies providing seed to farmers, and then the industry began to change. And some of the events that caused that industry to change are listed on this slide, and I have 3 of those listed. First, private companies began developing their own inbred lines. So rather than having those inbred lines being public, as in the university developing them and then distributed to individual companies, the private companies began to develop their own lines. Obviously, they would do that so that they could have an advantage over the other companies. They wouldn't give those inbred lines to other companies. They might sell the use of those to other companies, but private companies again began into the business of developing those inbred lines. Related to that was strengthening of patent law applications to seed. And a number of individuals point to the Plant Variety Protection Act of 1970, and I listed an article here. It's rather. That was a big event, but there was also a number of other events that led to to strengthening of patent laws. You see Howard article listed there if you want to follow up on them. But this law essentially protected companies or protected the property rights of the companies in their inbred lines and other knowledge that they gained from their breeding and genetics activities. So, private companies began to breed those lines. Protection was offered to them by a Patent Variety Protection Act, which is an act of the U.S. Congress giving them protection of those inbred lines and other knowledge. So the two sort of went together. And then finally, we had the introduction of biotechnology. Biotechnology is the technology that has been in the public eye the most. The biotechnology that probably has received the most attention is the GMO, the genetically modified organism. And those have been inserted in both corn and soybeans. Essentially what this is the insertion of a gene into the structure of the plant. So that gene is different than the corn itself. So we're taking a gene, inserting it into the plant. In some sense, what we're doing here is the same thing as we have been done for centuries by breeding, selective breeding, but we're now taking something foreign and putting foreign to the plant itself and putting it into the plant. Some readings on biotechnology related to this. For more background, you see those listed there, agricultural biotechnology, and then a link to it. In corn, we now have in the United States well over 90% of the hybrids that are planted have some sort of GMO in it. And there's 3 types of GMOs that are now in existence in corn plants. The first of those is herbicide resistance. So what the plant is bred that if it is sprayed with either of the 2 herbicides that you see listed there, it will not hurt them. So one of those is glyphosate, which is Roundup ready. Actually, you can buy glyphosate in any store. Go to a hardware store or Lowe's or your choice of big box stores. You can buy Roundup ready herbicide. It's actually glyphosate. Glyphosate is a herbicide that is designed or originally killed everything. It's a contact spray. It has no carryover impact, so very little environmental impacts to be either glyphosate or glyphosate. So, but the idea here was we bred these plants, corn plants, to be herbicide resistant. We could go in and then spray Roundup ready over the plant. It would kill everything. Very benign herbicide. At that point in time, no known environmental issues associated with glyphosate. We also had in there other traits are rootworm control, which is in essence the plant produces a protein that's harmful to rootworms in the same thing with corn borer. So you see the three characteristics listed there. Herbicide, rootworm, corn borer. Soybeans, a pretty prevalent GMO modification is herbicide resistance. All of these traits or combination of traits are owned by companies, and actually what they own is the event that causes them. You see here a list of 7 companies. These are 7 companies that own corn biotechnology traits. The first 4 of these are listed in an article by Nielsen and the Compendium of Biotechnology Corn Traits from Purdue University. This was a 2010 publication, and at that point in time, Bayer had glufosinate, or Liberty Link. Dow, Monsanto, and Syngenta had BT, rootworm, and herbicide resistance of both categories. So the laggard in terms of trait there was Bayer, And arguably, and actually not all that arguably, Monsanto was the most innovative of those companies listed. They were the ones that were the face of biotechnology, put more of their emphasis on biotechnology than the other four companies or other seven companies. 5, 6, and 7, DuPont, Aventis, and Stein Biotechnology also have biotechnology traits. We got those from a list of a Center for Environmental Risk Assessment. You can Google that area, look for corn traits, and you can see those listed there. But these 7 companies own corn traits. So we have 3 factors. Seed companies own their own inbred lines and have intellectual property rights. Federal government passes laws protecting property rights, and there are reciprocity agreements, and other nations follow the lead of the U.S. in protecting seed companies. And we have biotechnology. Those 3 factors led to many mergers and acquisitions, so we went from hundreds of seed corn companies down to the big 6. Monsanto, U.S. company. DuPont, U.S. company. Syngenta, a Swiss company. Bayer, German. Dow, U.S. BASF, a German company. All those companies are large, relatively large, multinational firms, and they are the ones that are involved in seed and, for that matter, plant protection as well. As we said, we saw many of those firms, hundreds of seed companies become merged into the big 6 here, and the diagrams that are in our reading for this week illustrate those mergers. Here is a diagram for Monsanto. You can see the companies that used to exist and now are owned or controlled by Monsanto. I circled 2 of those, DeKalb, we talked about DeKalb earlier, and Asgrow. Both of those are still brands that are brought to the front and many people recognize. For this class, don't go out and memorize this number of companies that formed Monsanto, but note that Monsanto merged and acquired actually, a vast number of smaller seed corn companies, and now is one of the big 6. Here you see the acquisitions by Syngenta and DuPont. Again, I circled 2 of these, Northrop King, again from an earlier slide, and Pioneer as well. Pioneer used to be, as a standalone company, the largest seed corn company in the nation. It had the largest number of acres sold to, and now it's a part of DuPont. Here you see Bayer listed at the top, Dow at the bottom, and again the companies that they acquired. In the middle is Lindgren and Land of Lakes. Circle those now. Those are 2 cooperatives. Land of Lakes is a U.S. cooperative. Lindgren is a French cooperative, and stand outside the big 6 in their farmer-owned cooperative. So here you see the big 6 life science companies or seed companies listed. These companies also have contractual relationships with one another. Many of these are related to licensing agreements. For example, Monsanto may have a specific trait event that the other companies license, and you can see there that where those are listed. Monsanto is the company with the most linkages to the other companies, primarily because they were the most active in developing biotech traits that came to market. So as we're speaking here today, we have the big 6, and they are going to be further consolidations, and 3 potential mergers are going on today. These mergers have been announced. Some of them have passed their respective shareholder meetings and with a positive vote, and all of them are in some degree waiting on regulatory approval from U.S., EU, or whomever. 3R, Monsanto, U.S. company, perhaps the most aggressive in the biotech area, most aggressive, owns many more companies than a lot of the others. And Bayer is a German company, really not much of a player in the corn seed market, but a big conservative company, again located in Germany. Second merger that's on the way is Syngenta, a Swiss company, with ChemChina. ChemChina, a state-owned Chinese company. Again, merger possibilities there. Final one is DuPont, which owns Pioneer, and Dow. Both of those are U.S. companies, and again, we would see a concentration. These mergers would take down our big six to obviously a smaller number of firms if they all went through. So, what's causing these mergers to happen now? I guess I would list three reasons. First, the seed industry is probably in the consolidation phase. It's no longer a young industry. Scale and focus are important. Scale, we have to have the scale necessary to do the research and the focus to do it as well. Second reason is the importance of securing intellectual property. All of these companies have purchased seed companies. In part of the reason for doing so is to get access to their genetics and their knowledge behind those genetics, so a few more mergers would consolidate that knowledge. Finally, third reason, owning the biotech traits themselves. In my opinion, this is probably the least important of the three. Biotech traits probably rank below the importance of just having the genetics and the know-how behind that genetic knowledge. So we'll talk more about those issues in our class and modules for the next several weeks. Here are some study questions from our first module. Who are the big six and how do we get to the big six? Describe the factors changing the industry from hundreds of firms to fewer firms. And finally, who is currently considering merger.